Hello and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. So today we're joined by Dr. Ash Patel, who is an anaesthetist by training who transitioned from medicine and deep into finance. And he's currently a managing director in the capital solutions group for Houlihan Lokey, a global investment bank. Prior to this, he was an early employee at Babylon, where he served as the clinical technology director before then moving into VC as an investor for Mercia and Optum Ventures. Hello, Ash, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Jing. Thanks for having me. Really excited.
Brilliant. So let's start from the beginning. A question we ask all our guests. What got you into medicine?
So look, I wish I had a really good story around like a central burning passion or a desire, a lifelong desire to be a doctor. The truth is, it was 2003 and I was an Indian kid in North London who was good at science. So someone suggested to me I should go to medical school. I thought that sounded kind of cool. I did some work experience, which was super interesting. And then when you go into school and say, I'm going to get all top grades in science, A levels, and I want to go to medical school, no one says, don't do that. So, so I did that. And hence I went to medical school. And I was lucky enough to go to Oxford Medical School, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I have to say, after graduating, I really loved being a doctor. It was tremendous fun. So I'm someone who's always enthusiastic about what he's doing, but I really enjoyed my time in medicine when I was doing it. But no, the origin story is one of perhaps a slight lack of imagination and not realizing the world was quite as big as I now appreciate that it is.
And that is honestly a common story that we hear from a lot of our guests. You know, you make your decision when you're 16 years old, you've got a certain kind of ethnic background where it's, perhaps encouraged and you've got all the grades to match. So, certainly at 16, people don't have a huge imagination as to what they want to do. But at that point, were you toying with any kind of other subjects? Like, were you entertaining other fields?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't do the typical I did a lot of the typical medical A levels. I did chemistry, physics, maths, and economics. I didn't do biology. And what my economics teacher told me and my parents at a parents' evening one year that I should go study economics university. And he said you could become a banker. And I had no idea what that meant because no one in my family had ever worked in investment banking or worked in banking any description. So I genuinely thought, and this is 100% true, I genuinely thought that meant working on your high street bank, like in HSBC or Santander. And they used to have these little pass books where you'd go in and they'd stamp the books and check how much. And I thought that's what that meant. So I actually went on my high street in Stanmore High Street. At the time, there were 6 or 7 different local branches of banks. And I went in with my CV one summer to go see if I could get some work experience to get a job. And they basically told me, like, I don't think this is what your teacher's talking about. This isn't, you're not going to work here. And nothing's anything wrong with working there, but it just wasn't, retail banking wasn't clearly what he had in mind. And I kind of left it at that. And I said, oh, right, okay, well, I kind of don't really understand. It's a bit of a dead end for me. I don't really understand what it is that is. I don't know anyone doing that. The internet wasn't as well developed as it is now. This is, 20, 25 years ago. We're talking, I'm 39. So this was, a fair few decades ago now. And so finding access to that kind of information was really tough. I did, ask around, but never got anywhere with it. And so, whereas when you say you want to do medicine, I understood doctors, I understood hospitals, I understood my GP surgery. That felt a lot more relatable, and it was just a much easier path to go down.
Wow. That is really prescient to your future career. So it's super interesting to hear that. But we'll touch upon that later on. Now, I suppose, it sounds like quite a typical background. And then you went to Oxford as a medical student. Now, a lot of our guests will talk about the transition from being a really smart kid in school to going to medical school, where the game changes. And certainly that was the case for me. I went to Oxford as well, and I was completely out of my depth. How was it for you? Did you adapt well? Did you did it make you think about what your, whether or not medicine was right for you in the future, or were you very much kind of in the zone?
So I loved it there. I had a fantastic 6 years at the university. The course there is very traditional, so kind of 3 years at the time. I think it might still be, but the first 3 years of undergraduate are basic sciences and lab time, and the final 3 years are all clinical time. There's very little kind of clinical work in the first 3 years at all. Um, I found it intellectually stimulating. Had some, still have some amazing friends from there. Um, I think the benefit of a collegiate-based university, of which there are kind of a handful in the UK, a lot of my friends to this day even were people who weren't studying medicine, and so they were studying like you know archaeology and biochemistry and physics and maths and all sorts of stuff, right? And I think naturally as we came to the end of our second and third years, I was going to go to clinical school and continue studying for another 3 years and finish my medical degree, and they were all applying for jobs.
Mm,
And I think that was probably the first time I had an insight into the fact that like there was a careers market out for talent and skills that weren't necessarily linked directly to your degree course. So my like
mm,
some of my friends who were studying sciences weren't going off to be scientists. They were going to go off to work in the city, or they're going to retrain to become lawyers, or they were going to go work for charities, or whatever else it might be. And it was really interesting to me at that point that, so you don't have to become a biochemist if you study biochemistry at university. You don't have to become a mathematician if you study maths at university. You can take those skills and you can do something else. But it was only a fleeting intellectual moment. I was still very much committed to a career in medicine, and I was hugely enjoying it at the time. It probably didn't help that my third year was 2007, and Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, and so
yeah.
many of my friends who were expecting to have like great careers in various things suddenly found themselves in a spot bother. So it felt like a safe harbor in some respects. So at the time, I was quite pleased to be at medical schools. Being a student for 6 years was my idea of heaven, and if I had my time again, I would have tried to make it longer. But it was a great experience. But it was formative because I met people doing different things, and later in life, certainly, conversations with those friends I met as an undergraduate were part of the thing that prompted me to look for careers outside of the traditional clinical pathway.
That's such a great point, actually. And when I used to work in widening access, because I did a lot of work to encourage students from all backgrounds to apply to Oxbridge, essentially.
Oh.
One of the things that I did tell them was that collegiate environment means that you actually do get exposed to a broad range of perspectives. And yes, as you said, your friendships become far more diverse than just the medical students that you're with. And I think that is something that is not widely appreciated, certainly not at the age of 16 or 18, when you're choosing your university. But as you say, it's really formative, and no doubt that had probably a subtle influence that grew with time as all your friends, developed and grew in their respective careers. That you're constantly being exposed to these alternative career paths, because I do think that medicine as a career is very insulated. You hang out with all these people who live in the hospital, and it becomes a bit of an echo chamber of clinical practice, where it becomes then very difficult to then get a wider perspective. And especially in today's current climate, where a lot of people are thinking about alternative careers, doing things differently, they don't really have the network then to explore that.
I think that's very true, and I know you touched upon it previously in conversations you and I have had, but like I think asking 16-year-olds to pick A levels to go do a job for the rest of their life I think, is just lunacy in my view.
Mm,
Like,
mm,
if there's, I give this career talk at my old school because again, very passionate about people making good career choices,
mm,
and I say like, how many of you, if your child came home from school at the age of 16, said I met someone at the bus stop, I want to marry them and be with them for the rest of my life. How many of you parents would say this is a great idea? You'd all think this is a turkey. So, grow up a bit, explore the world, figure out who you are first, and then settle down. Sure, settle down
mm,
eventually, but, figure out who you are first before you do that. Yet we ask, and frankly, marriage is a lot more reversible than it is your career choice in some respects. And so you end up in a situation whereby 16-year-olds effectively marry themselves off to a career, not
mm.
really understanding that career, not understanding what the alternatives are. And I think medicine is fascinating because it is still competitive, still very prestigious. It attracts some really bright minds, and those bright minds could be bright in lots of different dimensions.
Mm.
And so that, maybe medical training and medical career is the right path for them, fantastic. But if that's the case, it would still be the right path for you after your undergraduate degree. And I for the life of me, I don't understand why we don't adopt more of a US style or Canadian style system where you do a undergraduate degree, and then if you're 21, 22, you make a choice. That's a little bit more grown up than 16. Anyway, that's my one rant on that point.
I th- I think it's a really fair point, and I've thought the same thing myself, and it might help address, some of the retention issues that we have in the NHS today. If people, develop a bit more kind of career experience, a bit more life experience, they're making a more informed choice, and then potentially they stick it out for the duration, especially given the cost and the investment that the government makes in clinical training. But I just want to touch upon that experience then as a medical student, because it sounds like you were, very focused on becoming a doctor. You seem to really enjoy your time at university. Um, were you pursuing any alternative projects during those early years, or did that all come much later?
If you classify as trying to go to as many student nights as possible, as humanly possible, then yes, I was very active on alternative projects. No, I was look. I wasn't. I don't think I was the most studious student,
Mm,
and my tutors would probably say the same thing. That said, always got good grades. I never thought of them as projects at the time, but I remember, for example, I was one of the first 100 users of Facebook in the UK because a friend of mine in the computer
mm,
science department had an invite. It was invite only to universities,
mm,
certain universities when it launched in the UK, and I was one of the first people to join. I was always interested in technologies and how they were evolving and developing. But I was, I wasn't, and I ended up becoming the treasurer of various student societies, perhaps as
mm.
a harbinger of kind of what will later happen in life. But I wasn't, I wasn't politically active. I wasn't really like, I wasn't running a business or anything like that. And you meet students these days, and they're just like, I'm actually a little bit intimidated. You're like, wow, you meet these kind of 19-year-old, 20-year-olds, and they're like, I'm running, got my own startup, and I'm doing a United Nations, and I'm,
Mm.
volunteering at soup kitchens on weekends. And like, geez, I mean, I just about work and put my trousers on most days, and like, and it's really, I think there's a whole generation who have a much more savvy perspective of the world. One thing I did do though was I met with lots of people, and I think, we could touch about this later, perhaps in the conversation, but at an early age, just learning how to go up and talk to people and like
Mm,
start
mm,
conversations with strangers, like if you're naturally a chatty person, even if you're not, I think is
mhm,
it's something which is trainable, and university is a
mm,
great place to learn how to do that because it's almost like a risk-free environment where there are lots of other people who want to talk to you too. And so, like getting one thing I'd say to any young person is of course, carry on with all the great stuff you're doing, but don't do it from behind a screen entirely. Like some of the best stuff in life you're going to get from talking to people, and university is a great place to go do that.
So did you do any of that whilst you were a student, or did it come later on?
I wasn't proactively networking in the what I would
Mm,
kind of in that sense of the word. It was to me, networking implies a sense of intentionality of trying to
mm,
see who's around you and see how connections can be put together. There was none of that. But I always maintained quite a broad and diverse set of friends. And that friendship group was always
mm,
expanding and adding new people to it. And to this day, like I often joke. I like to collect books, wine, and people. I love meeting interesting people.
mm, mm,
And perhaps my early days at Oxford were great examples of just meeting lots of different people from very different backgrounds to my own, who viewed the world in totally different ways, who've all gone on to do interesting things, and I think that's one of the great benefits of being at university in a collegiate university environment, but any university, frankly, in the UK, is there are people from all walks of life, and talking to many of them as possible is sometimes the most interesting thing you can do.
And it's so true. Just touching upon your point about university being a risk-free environment. So whilst it doesn't sound like the case for you, many of the guests that we have, including myself, in fact, did student projects. And of course, we had a lot of naive optimism. We thought we were going to build incredible things. But as students, there's no real hard commitments. and you definitely have nothing to lose. So to your point about trying things, putting yourself out there, um, I think that's really sensible advice. So in my case, I tried student stand-up. And I was at the time, perceived as like a funny kid, but I certainly wasn't very confident. And the idea of standing in front of a stage of, 200 people was incredibly daunting. But I thought to myself, well, firstly, I committed to that experience. And then I basically just stressed myself out for a month up until the event. But I thought to myself, if I can get through this and I can make people laugh and I can come out of it unscathed, then I can face anything. And it turned out to be a great experience. Whilst I didn't become an incredible comedian, it definitely built my abilities for public speaking. And in subsequent years, whenever I think of anything stressful in front of a crowd, I think, well, it could never have been as hard as trying to make 200 Oxford students laugh. Um, my peers in my own college. So completely resonate with what you're describing. And so moving on from, your days as a medical student, let's talk a little bit about then, your transition into becoming a junior doctor, or resident doctor, as they call it, and then your journey into anaesthetics. So talk me through some of that. How did that look for you?
So I applied for what we called foundation jobs at the time. I think they still
Mhm.
call that. And I
Yes.
got into North Central Thames, which was my first choice deanery. So it's basically kind of the North London
Very
corridor.
good.
Um, and I went to work in two district general hospitals versus kind of more academic centres.
Mm,
Um, but it had the set of rotations that I really wanted to do. So there was kind of surgery, medicine, A&E, kind of the stuff that I was kind of interested in from medical school. I kind of had a sense that that was things that were more procedural were perhaps going to be more interesting to me, or more acute were going to be more interesting to me than things that perhaps more chronic disease management, for example.
mm,
Um, and so first set of rotations were at the North Middlesex Hospital. Man, what an eye opener! You think you're smart until it's 6 p.m. and you haven't figured out how to bleed all the patients on the ward. And you
mm,
suddenly,
mm.
the knowledge of the Krebs cycle, although useful, is kind of pointless if you
Yeah.
can't get the Venflon in. And so like it was a bit of a baptism of fire, and I learned really quickly that although I'd gone to a very academic and prestigious university, there were colleagues of mine who'd gone to less academic universities but had much better skills in terms of actually doing the job. And it was a humbling experience for me for my first few weeks on the job, when far from being like a kind of the swagger of someone who's going to be really good, I suddenly realized that actually I was mid-ranking at best, and actually there was a lot to be learned here. And I think that experience was again formative, and it teaches you that as you shift from environment to environment, the skills that are useful shift as well. And part of the job is to learn what is actually the useful thing that needs to get done here, and to get better at
Mm.
that thing versus holding on to the thing that made you great previously. Right. So, writing essays on the immune system is not helpful on a weekend on call. Bottom line. Like it's just not, that isn't what an F1's needed to do. Um, and so like that was for me like a real experience in learning how to get good at something very quickly.
And how did that change your perspective about your career? Were you, I, I suppose a lot of guests and a lot of clinicians will say that the transition from being a student into a practicing clinician is a bit of a baptism of fire. We're approaching junior doctor rotations now. The August intake is coming imminently. And I think I remember my time, and that idea of taking the theoretical and applying it is, it's quite a shock to the system. I guess I'm curious to know if that changed your perspective then on how you saw your career, or whether or not you were then thinking, "Oh, is this not for me? Do I want to look at alternatives?" Or did this just motivate you to excel and carry on, driving to become that specialist?
So I loved it. Like I
Mm,
absolutely loved my junior doctor years. It was so much fun, and I loved my job. And there are still bits of it to this day. I mean, I haven't practiced medicine in over 10 years now, but to this day, I happily say there are bits of my old job that I miss and I'll never get again. And I'm so glad that I did them. I think it definitely, it was definitely baptism of fire. It definitely shaped the way I viewed the world a bit differently as well. Coming from, Oxford, which is quite a rarefied environment, into a district general in quite a deprived community. Like, you see the world. I was meeting people I'd never met people who lived those kinds of lives before, right? And so, like, it was, for me, it definitely changed my perspective on the world and on people. I also say that when you first go into the world of work, different to being a student, although it may be a similar environment, hospital, that as a student, my focus was always on, like, what do I need to learn in order to pass the exams at the end of this rotation, right? And that was kind of, you're there for a purpose. When you start work, the purpose is the job itself. And so then that was probably the first time I started looking at my seniors, the registrars and the consultants in the department, and thinking, right, this isn't no longer about trying to learn what I can from them to pass an exam in 6 weeks' time. This is about, do I want this person's job in 10, 20, 30 years' time? And
Mm.
making those kinds of decisions. I think that was the first inkling I had, that although I was enjoying what I was doing right now, I couldn't see myself doing it forever, and I probably didn't want to have their job in 30 years'
Mm.
time. I kind of wanted something different. I'm very open about this with people. It's not people don't often talk about this kind of stuff, but
Yeah.
as I said earlier, my move into medicine wasn't out of a passion or a calling. It was fortuitous, and it was slightly self-interested, right? In fact,
Yes.
entirely self-interested. I thought that it would make my life better if I was a doctor. That would look like the best path to making my own life better. And I looked at medicine in the NHS, and I thought, and I was, again, connecting my head with friends who are doing other career paths at this point and seeing the trajectory of their lives, thinking, actually, this isn't the career I want to be on long term, and I want to shift into something else which is perhaps a little bit more self-interested. And that was the first inkling. Now, don't get me wrong, I then did anaesthetics training, and again fell wholly in love with that field, and it was just so much fun. I was in St Mary's, Charing Cross, and Hillingdon for my core anaesthetics training, and man, that was a lot of fun. And worked with some really smart, nice, super capable people. Loved it, loved it. Um, but it never left me the idea that, much as this is fun, this isn't what I want to be doing in 20 or 30 years' time, right? And so,
Fine. I think you'll get a sense from all the questions so far that I've been probing to see when that moment was when you thought to yourself, actually, this may not be the long-term path for me. Because so far in the story, it sounds like you were a model student in the sense that, you went through medical school, you loved it, you got the your top choice deanery, and you really enjoyed being a doctor. But it sounds like around that point, you were thinking to yourself as you looked at the seniors around you that might not be your long term future. But I just want to touch upon that choice of going into anesthetics. What was the reason for that? Was it strategic? Were you already thinking, well, I might not stick the course at that point? What was going through your head at the time?
it just looked super interesting, super fun. It was a mixture of practical, intellectual. There's gadgets to play around with. Like, when things are all going wrong, they're the doctors who can come in and really, like, turn things around. It's short attention spans, so kind of like, you're not managing a patient over 6 months, 6 years, 6 decades. As chronic medicine, as modern medicine is now becoming, it was like, let's get this fixed today, and let's make some
Mm.
decisions today. And it's data driven. There's numbers being thrown at you the whole time from various monitors that the patients are on. So, in many respects, it was that, blend of science and numbers and medicine, which I really enjoyed. Um, I it was interesting because I actually applied for a job at the end of my F2 in pharma. So I actually applied for an industry position. And the reason I got into that
Mm.
was I was led astray, I often say, by, like, a very, very good friend of mine, a guy called Professor Chao Kwan, who's now Professor of Health Economics at Hong Kong State University. But he was one of my friends from medical school. And also a guy called Ankit Jethwa, who's now an investor of Soft Never Partners. He's a biotech investor. and we all lived together in a shared house. So these are my best mates. And Chow calls me one day and says, "Look, there's a career swap going on for medics, alternative careers for medics. I never heard of such a thing." But Chow's a smart guy, and so when Chow calls you, you kind of turn up to what he's doing because it's something interesting that's going to happen. He's just one of those guys. So I go
Yeah.
along to this careers talk, and I met a medic, another Oxford medic, who's a few decades older, but he had a career in pharma. I was like, whoa, like what is that? Like I'd never even occurred to me that that was even a thing that you could do. And this dude basically persuaded me to apply for a job at GSK. And at the time, they were launching something called the eScript program. I don't know if it's still running now, but it was basically like a mini MBA where doctors would come in and they would put you, if you got the job, they'd put you in training programs, 6 months in marketing, 6 months in the clinical trial development, et cetera, et cetera. So I applied and I kind of got through the written application and went to the interviews. And it was fascinating when I was there because there was myself, another guy I knew from Oxford who was a couple of years older than me, and then so we were both junior doctors, resident doctors at the time, and then like 6 consultants from absolute top tier institutions. Like we're talking like
Wow.
neurologists from Queen's Square, cardiologists from Brompton, pediatricians from Great Ormond Street, that kind of stuff. And that was one time when I thought this is really interesting because I got talking to them in the interview rooms. I thought, isn't it weird? I'm going to work my ass off for the next 15 years to get your job, yet you're here with me trying to get this job. Like something
Yeah.
isn't quite right here, right? The math ain't mathing. And so and that was my first inkling that that actually perhaps it wasn't the uplit sunland that I necessarily, for these people it wasn't, and maybe it wasn't going to be for me. For others, it clearly was going to be, and that's great too. And I got offered the job at GSK, and then the guy said to me, "Look, you're really young in your career to be making quite a drastic choice like this. So why don't you go and do your why don't you go and do some like actual proper medicine as a specialist? Maybe you get out of your system and you'll find something that you really care about, and maybe this isn't for you. And you can always come back to here later. Like GSK is not going anywhere. It's been here for hundreds of years, and we're always going to be hiring people like you." So I said, "Okay, cool." So that's when I then finished my application to go to do anaesthetics. Remember that weekend, and I went off and did it. And my full intention was, let's see how this goes. And I have to say, like I said earlier, I just loved it. It was just such good fun. But the thought never left my mind that the end outcome goal perhaps wasn't going to be something that I wanted super long term, but I was enjoying it whilst in the moment.
So what then motivated you to join Babylon?
Serendipity plays 99% of what we do in life, whether anyone chooses to tell you that or not. And so a good friend of mine who's now a partner at Oliver Wyman posted a Facebook message saying, sent me a Facebook message saying, "Hey, he was a junior analyst at a consultancy firm. Oliver Wyman's a consultancy firm. He was a junior analyst at the time. Hey, I've just worked with a really cool CEO who I think you should go talk to. Can I introduce you?" And so shout out to Saurav Chowdhury, who is fully to blame for my career. He was the guy that introduced me to Ali Parza, and who's the founder of Babylon. And so I went. I happened to be off the next 2 days as like 0 days when you've done a busy shift of on calls. So I was like, I had nothing planned. So I was like, cool, let me go see this guy again. Saurav's a smart guy. Like, something interesting must be happening if he's telling me to go meet somebody. So I just went along, and I'd never had a business casual meeting before in my life. So I turned up properly suited and booted, jacket, tie, the works, to go meet someone for a coffee in a hotel bar, because I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I met with Ali, and he was kind of described his vision for what healthcare could be like. And it aligned very closely with the view I'd had at the time, which was increasingly the most impactful areas of innovation where people's lives are being changed was in technology. Think that at the time Google Maps decided to become mainstream, and so you didn't need an A to Z anymore. You could just look up on Google Maps where you wanted to go. Uber was launching in the US, and so you didn't have to call Addison Lee for a taxi. You could just book one and it would come to you. And so it struck me when as I was speaking to Ali and exploring the idea that healthcare, which the model of which hadn't really changed in hundreds of years, was eventually going to become disrupted by technology. And I think, there are many companies doing that now. Babylon did it for a while, then ultimately didn't quite work out. But there are plenty of companies that are showing that technological disruption can happen, or at least technological innovation, even if you don't really disrupt a kind of an institution. And so I was a believer, and I still am a believer. I still
Mm.
fully believe that technology has the power to massively improve people's lives. And in healthcare, a domain characterized by just scarcity of resources, better application of technology can be a force multiplier for clinicians, the ability for people to be able to manage their own healthcare, whatever it is, but people can lead longer, healthier, happier lives as a direct result of technology. And tech doesn't need software. Antibiotics were a tech. When they were invented, they changed people's lives. AI is clearly a tech, and that's going to have a huge impact. It's already having a huge impact. But I was a believer, and so when Ali said to me, do you want to come on board and we're going to build this thing? I understood about 10% of what he was talking about, but I said, yeah, sure. Like this is going to happen. Whether we do it or not, I don't know, but it's going to happen eventually, and it has happened.
So I want to drill in a bit more about how you got the role, how you joined Babylon, because it sounds like you joined at a relatively early stage. You were introduced to Ali, you were sold the dream, and you were a believer. But how did it go down? Did he find a role for you? Was there a
Yeah.
job post going? Like how did that come about?
He there wasn't, and it's again for people who were thinking about startups as careers. This was pre. I mean, I'm pretty sure the SEC classified me as a co-founder. It says it from a shareholder perspective when the company floated, which unfortunately meant I couldn't
Wow.
sell quite as much as I'd like to. But like I was one of the very first early team members. We're talking kind of first few people round the table situation, and so there wasn't a job per se, but there was just everything that needed to be done. And so at that point, I was still working full time in the NHS. I was a CT2 in anaesthetics at Hillingdon, and this was like my evenings, weekends, on the days off after a night shift, literally whatever scraps of time I could find working on this business, which was really
Oh,
nothing more than an
wow.
idea. Um, and again, like totally naive to like how companies get built, but just realizing I was in an environment where a guy who built a successful business previously, Circle Group, was teaching me like how he viewed stuff and how he built stuff. And that just felt like a really good place to go learn something super interesting that aligned with the core beliefs of mine.
I didn't realize you joined so early when you were still working on Babylon whilst, actually
Yeah,
a practicing doctor.
yeah, it was 2013. I think I
Mm.
started working in November, December 2013. So it was like, years before we even fundraised.
And your title there was Clinical Technology Director. Did you land into that role, or was that something that you carved out
Uh,
as you were working?
we came up with that idea because I needed to put something in my contract. And so I wanted to do something clinical and I wanted to do something in technology, and director was a senior enough title that I thought it would help me to do my job. So that's why I became the clinical technology director. But it was an entirely made up name for an entirely made up job because at the time that involved everything from what software should we use to do video calling because HIPAA compliant video calling solutions weren't exactly obvious. This is the pre-Zoom mainstream era.
Mm.
How do you manage the CQC and are we going to be able to be compliant with different elements of the regulation? There was a different medical directive, but still from a tech perspective, is it going to
Mm.
be compliant? How do you recruit GPs? How do you think about trying to recruit GPs to join a platform? So it's a very broad range, and people who've got early startup experiences, you've had clearly with Patchwork as well, recognize, I'm sure, just those early days where you don't have these neat silos of jobs. There's just stuff that's got to get done today, and so I was just one of the guys getting stuff done.
And how was that transition from being a trainee into this very broad generalist tech role? Did you have imposter syndrome? How did you find learning and adapting in this completely different role?
So I weirdly I didn't have imposter syndrome because one of the great things of working with Ali, and he was a fantastic person to work with, a real like mentor, and I've always thought very highly of him and still do to this day. Um, but he made it clear that no one knew what they were doing because we were on the
Mm.
frontier. We were building when you're building something new. No one really knows what the right thing to do is. And I think that rather than thinking about kind of imposter syndrome or not, it's whether can someone get comfortable operating in an environment where the rules of the roads are still being written as you're going along. Some people actually like frameworks and knowing
Yeah.
what the right thing to do is and making progress against preordained kind of hierarchy or progress over whatever. And some people like the chaos. And at that point in my life, I really like the chaos. None of us knew exactly what we were doing. If we had, then someone would have already built the company by now, and so we wouldn't be doing that. But what we did do was try to apply our judgment, and certainly I tried to apply my professionalism and the core training of medical training, which is trying to do right by the patient, trying to make sure that what you're doing is to the highest standard that you can do it. Just apply that consistently within a startup environment, um, and hope that that helps to move the needle and push the project forward. And I like to think that it did.
I think that's a really good insight that I just want to explore a bit, because you said that, for yourself, you enjoyed the chaos. But I think what I see with a lot of clinicians today is they want these alternative careers because of the current climate of working in the NHS. But then I do think a question that many trainees need, or medical students need to ask themselves is, what kind of person are you? Because the benefit and the advantage of being in the NHS is that it's all very standardized. You do your exams every year, you can progress, and you just follow the pathway. And if you keep plugging away and ticking all the boxes, then you'll eventually get to become a consultant. Whereas in the world that you landed in joining Babylon, it became completely different, where you were having to navigate your own career path and hustle and learn with no clear kind of outcomes that you were targeting, where you were just kind of figuring out along the way.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And like, the environment was already starting to worsen in the NHS back in 2013. It's been a long and fairly steady decline, I'd say, in terms of people's morale. It's probably worse
Mm.
now than it has been for a very long time, as long as I can remember at least. Um, but I don't know. Like I've never done what I'm doing based on a negative emotion. I just think that's a
Mm.
really bad way to make decisions. Like you can't. You're never going to find the love of your life by saying all the things you don't like about people.
Yeah.
You've got to you've got to say what you do like about people, and you've got to say what you do like about your job, and what you do like about what you're doing, and then try to find things that align around that. And I like the confluence of technology. I like the commerciality. I like the hustle culture. Like that all aligned with what I cared about at that point in time. So, and to a degree, I hugely still do. Um, but if you're the kind of person that likes a pathway, there are other commercial paths you can go down, other career alternatives that offer a bit more structure. They just may not have the extreme volatility upside or downside that kind of environment offers.
So true. So we've talked a bit about your experience in Babylon, and then ultimately, well, eventually you chose to leave, to transition into venture capital. So what was your motivations at the time for leaving, and why VC?
So we'd raised a load of money. We'd raised a $25 million Series A, which at the time was the largest raise ever for digital health in Europe. I know it's probably chicken feed these days compared to what people do, but at the time that was a lot of money. And through that fundraising process, met some of the investors. And my sense was, whilst I was enjoying building Babylon with Ali, um, this wasn't something that I wanted to be doing forever. Um, and kind of an observation mine was that actually having exposure intellectually and financially to a whole heap of companies perhaps might be more interesting to me than just having exposure to one.
Mm.
Um, and so like that was a reasonably calculated decision of being like, look, I think there could be something else I could do, which I think I could enjoy even more than what I'm doing right now. And so I spoke to Ali about it, and ultimately made the decision. It was a difficult decision at the time, but made the
Mm.
decision to try and move into the investing world. And look, that was really tough because,
Mm.
back then, this is 2015, 2016, there were, you could count on one hand, all the physicians in Europe who were working as investors in venture. Now there's a lot, but there were very, very few back then. Real pioneers,
Mm.
people like Nell Sinner at F Prime or Andrew Edge and Christoph Rudig at Albion. Like there
Mm.
weren't many folks around. Um, and investment firms at the time basically wanted to hire ex-investment bankers or ex-management consultants, and with good reason, because they came with a
Yeah.
skill set that was easy to understand, easy. They knew what you could do, they knew what you couldn't do, and you could be packaged up into a training program within an investment firm to move from analyst to associate to principal to partner. And I hadn't done that. Um, but I found a really enterprising group at Mercia who had basically set up a new investment firm. Um, and it was tiny. At the time, I didn't even appreciate how tiny it was. They had like 20 million in funds under management. It now has north of 2 billion. But at the time,
Wow.
it was tiny little fund. And I joined as like, I must have been something between 15 and 20 in the team. Like, there's hundreds of
Mm.
employees there now. Small group, again, working directly with the CEO and with a very senior investor who's my boss, Peter Steins, who's now heads the entire ventures business. And again, it was, for me, it was the same thing. Two mentors who were building something interesting in a space I wanted to learn more about. They wanted someone with expertise in healthcare services, in particular in digital health, which was hard to find because there weren't many. You couldn't find many people who'd worked in digital. There was no such thing as digital healthcare for a start.
Mm.
We didn't. It
Mm.
was called e-health or m-health, and no one knew what the hell to call this thing. And
Yeah.
so so they were willing to take a punt on a guy who'd spent time building a company in that space, and they thought that could be an interesting space longer term. And they were willing to train me and teach me about financial stuff, how to read a set of accounts, that kind of thing, which I had no idea how to do. And that was a really good trade off, and so I went to Mercia.
So I guess that was going to be my follow-up question, which is that it's fairly common, certainly in places like the States, where operators, early stage employees in startups transition into venture capital, and people are far more willing to take that risk. But I think in the UK, as you've stated, the people who go into venture capital come from more traditional kind of finance backgrounds. You mentioned about them taking a gamble on you and I guess training you on some of the financial elements that you may have, that you would have had less exposure to. How did you find that transition and learning those, I guess, the financial skills? What were those years like for you?
Late nights, night school, weekends, studying and reading. But excellent training when you're a junior doctor, to be perfectly honest with you. It's not that different to doing your college exams, right? Everyone else is partying and you're there looking at textbooks. Um, but it was, yeah, it was more hard graft. And it was, but the thing to remember with all of these things is that it's all learnable. Like
Mm.
if you want to learn it, you can learn it. It's just how badly do you want to learn it? And I really wanted to learn it. So I made my life around that for the next period of time, around just getting really good at this craft and understanding it to the point where, you could. I like to think within it took time, maybe a couple of years or so, but you could be as fluent in that particular domain and as competent in that domain as anyone that you could point to. And then overlaying on top of that a level of expertise around technology and around healthcare. My thesis was that would be put me in a unique position. And they turned out to be very helpful.
Was it daunting making the first few deals?
Hugely, barely, and it, hugely, and it would have been almost prohibitively so had it not been for the fact that I had some really good mentors. And so,
Mm.
like, a team who was, and again, people thinking about moving into other careers. I was very transparent about what I was good at and what I didn't know anything about. And I think that people don't often do that. They think that they need to be good at everything and to, dare I
Yeah.
say, bullshit a bit that they can do everything. And in truth, none of us can, right? All of us have our areas of expertise and our areas of ignorance. And so I've always been super clear with folks in anything I'm doing that, look, here's what I'm really good at, and you won't find better than me at this. And here's the stuff that I don't even know what these words mean, to be perfectly honest with you. And don't ask me to do that second bunch of stuff. It's going to go badly wrong, or at least help me to do it. Talk me through it. I'll learn. I'm a really quick learner, but let's go do this stuff together because I don't know how to do that. And they were extremely supportive and really good mentors, still friends to this day. And that really helped me to move forward. But I remember my first few deals. I mean, trying to do a sensitivity analysis of a financial model when you'd never seen a financial model before, that's um that's a tough one, man, and that really isn't in the textbooks. But we learned through doing, and I had great people to help me learn along the way.
Brilliant. And I suppose from that experience at Mercia, you went more and more deeper into finance, going to Optum and then going into more traditional investment banking. So talk me through that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been at Mercy for about 3 years at this point. Optum, which is Optum Ventures, which is the investment arm of United Health Group, US's largest health insurer, was setting up the European operations at the time. Um, and the partner who's leading the team at the time, lady called Heather Roxburgh, who I think now is Oxford Science Enterprises. I'd gotten to know Heather through just a circuit, I guess, but again, going out networking. And a recruiter called me to say, "Oh, Heather's recruiting for this new team. Do you want to come along?" So I went along for a meeting. And again, it was a digital healthcare focused investment firm, which aligned perfectly with what I wanted to do. It was much more international in its reach. It's a US firm investing pan-European, in fact, global, out of London. And for me, the ability to be able to access deals outside of the UK, perhaps slightly later stage deals as well, late stage venture, early growth equity, as opposed to very early
Mm.
stage venture. Again, stuff that I wanted to expand my skill set into, and where I thought there was a real commercial reason to do so. And so I signed up to Optum, and I was there for the next couple of years. Again, great fun, great team. Heather, a guy called Vijay Bharathan, is still a partner there now. Um, and I, three of us were doing deals across Europe, and we had a fantastic team around us as well. Some of them have built some great businesses in their own right. Um, uh, we learned a lot about how I learned a lot certainly around just how healthcare systems work in different countries and the nuances of that. I'd say my knowledge prior to that was very NHS and UK centric, and it really broadened my horizons around how things work in France, Germany, the US, India, Singapore, like other parts of the world, um, which I think is important because, as said earlier, the world is a lot bigger than you might otherwise think.
And you've developed all this kind of experience in and around healthcare, being an early stage operator in one of the hottest health techs at the time, and then you went into investment, still very much focusing around healthcare investing. But then I suppose towards the more recent kind of experiences in your career at, say, Deutsche Numis or at Houlihan Lokey, it seems like you went into more agnostic. You went sector agnostic into more pure investment banking. So can you walk me through how you thought about this? And did you feel like you were making a conscious choice to step away from, I guess, your clinical background?
Yeah, it wasn't so much stepping away from clinical background, but just realizing. So in our own portfolio at Optum, one of the things which we had to do was syndicate rounds and get other investors to come and invest in our portfolio companies. And I tried hiring bankers to do this for me because people said bankers can do this, and I just never met anyone who I thought could do this well. Um, and I was kicking around the idea with a friend of mine, David Kellner, who I still work with to this day. He'd been CFO at Babylon. He'd gone into
Mm.
VC, and then he had wound up at Numis um, as kind of the founding team member of their growth capital solutions team, fundraising advisory team. And I was saying to David, look, I'm basically spending so much of my own time helping my own portfolio companies to raise external capital. There's real little appetite options for us to monetize that. We're not a bank, we're just pure investment house. Um, and he said to me, like, I think there's a real business which we could build here. So and to me, the idea stuck with me was that actually the core skill set of being able to identify great companies, figure out are these going to be good investments for people to make, and then find the right kinds of people to connect that capital in to that company was a skill that was important. It was needed because we needed it for our own portfolio, and there seemed to be no one doing it in Europe particularly well. It was like another
Mm,
blank space. This was to me where telehealth was in 2013. It was obvious that you should put a GP. Now it seems obvious you put a GP on the end of a Zoom call. Then it didn't. That was a totally non-obvious thing to do, but clearly there was utility in doing it. And to me, when we started the advisory business at Numis, which eventually was acquired by Deutsche Bank and became Deutsche Numis, it was it was non-obvious, I suspect, to many, but it seemed clear to us that there was demand for what we were doing, and it was a useful thing for us to do. And what we found was that the demand came from all sorts of different sectors. So it wasn't just from healthcare. We had a lot of demand from tech companies, consumer companies, fintech companies. And so it made sense as anyone building a business is you build a business to service the market that wants your services. So no, we weren't purists about healthcare, although we still to this day healthcare is probably about a third of what I do now. We've just closed
mm,
a large healthcare deal in the UK. Um, but I felt that I could leverage my expertise in from the investing side and the technology side into other industries. And that's turned out to be incredibly powerful and useful. I'd also say it's probably made me better in some respects at healthcare because a lot of what healthcare does is down the track from where technology and consumer technologies have been earlier in the life cycle. And so having an appreciation for what is how is validation being done in fintech companies and how will that eventually apply to healthcare insurance companies, I think is an interesting exercise. And I'm already starting to see, we see clients where with clients in a different industry were doing things, and now the same methodology is being implemented in healthcare companies, which I think is super interesting. So it's perhaps a bit more symbiotic than first appears.
fair enough. Fair enough. And you can clearly see, from from everything that you've described, the journey and how it made sense to you to where you are today. So then, thinking a bit about your current career and I guess your clinical practice, you mentioned that you were, moonlighting in Babylon whilst also being a full-time trainee. So at some point you decided to give it all up. How did you make that decision? Like, did you believe, was there a part of you that thought you could continue both things in parallel? How did you work that out?
It came to the end of my CT2 year, and I had an SC3 number, but I decided not to take it up. And the reason I didn't take it up was I thought we were building something super interesting at Babylon, um,
Mm,
and I was hugely enjoying that. Um, I was working literally every hour, every second
mm,
God would send me, right? And so at the time I was engaged, now married, thankfully my wife's still with me, but at the time she barely saw me because I was just working the whole
mm,
time. And it just struck me that I think to do something, to be truly good at something, you've got to focus on it. Um, Now, there are people who have portfolio careers, and I think if different bits of your portfolio feed one another and are symbiotic in that way, it makes sense to continue a portfolio career. So I don't
mm.
disparage those. But what I was doing was so orthogonal, it felt at times, that really like every
Yeah,
day I spent away from the patient working in Babylon was a day that I wasn't getting good at anesthetics. And every day
yeah,
that I spent in anesthetics was a day that I wasn't getting better at building the business. And so that to me was a junction. Um, and I chose the commercial route, which at the time, it's great these days to see so much more proactivity and positivity around people taking alternative career paths. At the time, 2013, like no one I knew had ever done that. Um, and it was a bit of an odd path to take. It certainly, I'm sure, if I know ARCP raised a few eyebrows with my deanery, who I don't think were best pleased. Um, but you get one life, man. Like you got to do what you want to do. And
yeah. I mean, that makes complete sense. And you're definitely right. There needs to be a certain level of mastery. It was something that Anas and I thought about as well. Whilst you could argue that there was more overlap in being practicing locum clinicians whilst building a workforce management company, the reality of it was, as you said, time spent in the hospital meant you were taking away time from building the business, and in turn, we certainly weren't spending enough time in the hospital to be progressing and building our clinical skills. And I recall the moment for me was when I returned on shift and I actually forgot how to bleep. One of the most fundamental things that you do in a hospital, I didn't know how to, what the number was. It just slipped my mind. And I thought at that point, maybe it's time to hang it up because, whilst the clinical skills and the clinical knowledge may be there, if you can't even navigate the practical elements of it, you're not going to be as efficient. You're just going to be taking up a slot of someone else, and there'll be much better clinicians that will be more efficient. So that was, the deciding point for me. A follow-up question. Do you have any regrets around any of the choices that you made along the way? Because from what I'm hearing, it's been success after success, rise upon rise. Is there anything that you regret, clinical or otherwise?
I don't have regrets. I would say it's not always a success after success. Like that, I think that's a nice PR scheme, which it can look like, but there's been failures along the way as well. And there's been things that haven't always gone to plan, and times where you take a sucker punch as well. And you got to learn how to roll with those. Um, I but I really enjoy my job. Like what I do now, operating in financial markets, understanding how money flows around the world into interesting businesses, helping to finance companies that I think need to exist in some cases. I've had in every case, really. Like I'm generally very passionate about the clients that I work with. I really care about their companies and I want them to win. I really like what I do, and it's kind of served my North Star today. And I wouldn't have got here had I not gone down these paths. So it's kind of the old Steve Jobs thing of you connect the dots looking backwards, right? Like in retrospect, it looks like a very fluid, logical series of things. At the time, you can tell from the story, a friend calls me with one thing, so I go along to it. And then you do it for a bit and you like it, but then you see something else and you think, maybe I can just make a little step from where I am now to there. And so you make the little step. And it's all just a series of little steps, and then you tell in your retirement speech, you tell a grand story about how it was all ordained and you left the nursery, at the age of 2 and said, I'm going to go do this. And that's bullshit. The markets evolve, you evolve with them. That's been my philosophy. And you point yourself in the direction that most aligns with your own interests and what you want out of stuff. You commit to it when you're there, that you give it your all, you work your hardest, you don't make excuses for why things don't work out, you own the failures as well as the successes. But as long as you're doing something useful, and I think, I'm very passionate about being useful. So as long as, I'd like to think that I serve a purpose for the people that I work with, and that's useful, right? So that helps to direct what to do next.
Brilliant. I think, from your story, there's definitely an element of serendipity. And of course, at the later stages, you can, tell the narrative however you want. But you were also very strategic as you assessed every opportunity and milestone along the way. So we're running out of time now. So I'm going to finish with one last question, which is, what practical advice would you give to other clinicians who are considering alternative careers, who are also thinking about what they do in the future?
Go and talk to people. Like it can be reaching out to people on LinkedIn and trying to have a Zoom call or a coffee. Offer to buy people a coffee and ask them, can I come and talk to you about yourself? People are wonderfully narcissistic. They'll come and talk about themselves all day long. I'm no exception to that, by the way. And so go and talk to people actually and ask good questions. Don't just ask how did you do it and how do I do the same? That's a bad question, because unless someone's on a pathway, you can't do the same. Like you can't come and do what I've done, not because I'm particularly brilliant, but because those unique set of circumstances may not exist for you. The better question to ask is, how do you evaluate the next set of choices, the stuff that you're talking about here today?
Yes.
And you really only get that when you go and actually meet people in person, I believe, like, or at least on a Zoom or something. But you invest the time, and you're asking them to invest
Yeah,
the time. But then you have a human to human connection and interaction. And you and I met at All Day
true.
Hospital in Liverpool.
Definitely.
Gosh, must be 10 years ago now, something like that. Like, and we've stayed in touch ever since. But we've both made the effort over the years to go see each other. I remember I came up all day to come see you in what was like a an Aladdin's cave of like amazing gadgets and stuff, which it was Professor Ian Hennessy was running in all day, right? And like, but honestly, would our relationship be as strong if we hadn't done that? Probably not, right? And vice versa. You come by and see me for coffee all the time too. So like, I think go out and see people, go and talk, ask thoughtful questions. Don't ask for a pathway unless you're talking to someone who's on a pathway. So now, if someone has a career, which is like I started at McKinsey as an analyst and I worked all my way up to partner, that's a pathway. Go talk about the pathway there. If someone's done startups and then investing and then moved into other stuff, like they're clearly not on a pathway, and it's not a great conversation you're going to have if what you want is a recipe book as to what you should do next.
I think that's really great advice. In some cases, you extract wisdoms from the way that they've solved the problems, but in other cases where it is a clear pathway, as you describe, then there's a bit more of a playbook that you can try and follow and emulate. And I think the intelligence comes from spotting which is which at any given moment. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Ash, for joining me. And for those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform that you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help us spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thank you for joining, and see you next time.